Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and much more. I'm your host, Alberto Padoan, live from a recording studio at ETH Zurich. Quick thanks to our sponsor, the National Center of Competence in Research on Dependable Ubiquitous Automation, which you can check following the link in the description. Our guest today is Alessandro Chiuso. Alessandro is a full professor at the University of Padua. Welcome to the show, Alessandro. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, there's many things to say. First of all, Alessandro is a professor at the University of Padua, where I've personally studied when I was a student myself. Padova is a very nice little town in the north of Italy with a very long history as well. I know that you, Alessandro, have studied both at Padova and in Bologna as well, right?
Well, it was really Padova because at the time I got my PhD, it was sort of a program coordinated by the University of Bologna, but I was really in Padova. So during my PhD, I was in Padova and abroad in the United States.
Yeah, so
it was really Padova.
I mean, there's a mini anecdote here for those who don't know about the history of universities in Italy, but Padova was founded 800 years ago this year, so in 1222. But it was kind of a detached section of Bologna, or at least it was a few students fleeing away from Bologna to find some more libertas scholastica, as they called it, so some more academic freedom, and kind of reminds also the rivalry between Cambridge and Oxford, more or less. It's kind of the Italian version of that. But yeah, maybe let's get the ball rolling. I would say maybe we can start with a bird's eye view of your personal research trajectory. So I know you're a prominent figure in the field of system identification, but what's your story? How did it all start?
Actually, I graduated in Padova in telecommunication engineering. And actually, when I first started my undergraduate studies, I was enrolled in an electrical engineering program. And then when I got to second year, then they started this program in telecommunication that at the time it was sort of the program of the what I wanted to do. So I switched to telecommunication engineering and I graduated. Actually, I was the first graduated in that program in Padova. So I was the first graduating and actually the first that left because the year after I started the PhD in, let's say, control, basically. And I got fond of this field when I was in my fourth year, let's say first year of master with the modern nomenclature. And I took this course on, it was called System Identification at that time. It was taught by Giorgio Picci, that then was my former PhD advisor. And I fell in love with this whole subject. So I got fascinated by filtering, estimation, and this sort of magic that you can sort of reconstruct things, make sense of data, and estimate dynamical systems. And then, that was how it all started. And then, many steps from there to here, but this is actually the seed, I would say.
So I find it interesting that you're technically then not originally a control engineer. You're a telecommunications engineer, but then somehow got dragged into the field.
Yes.
And for those who don't know, we should mention that Giorgio Picci is one of the most prominent figures in the history, let's say, at least of stochastic realization theory, for sure. Put a link in the show notes. But also he made extensive work in system identification and so many other fields. I guess one nice way to also continue this journey on your personal trajectory is perhaps understanding who were the most influential figures for you, the people that actually inspired you. So if you were to say name three, who would they be?
Well, for sure, name number one would be Giorgio Picci, and I owe him, a lot, I would say. I learned, let's say, how to do research, asking interesting questions, dig deep in the literature, looking at what happened in the past, at the origin of things. This is what was a driving force from the very beginning, and this is what I learned. Then for sure, say number two, I don't want to put a sort of an order in terms of less important, but for sure it came after. Stefano Soato was my sort of co-advisor during PhD, even though I was working with completely different things. He had been a student of Giorgio during his master, I believe, but then he moved to the States many years before I did, actually. And he moved to a sort of a neighboring field that was vision, computer vision. But then it was time for me to spend some time abroad. I wanted to go in a sort of to see different problems, but at the same time exploiting things that I knew and that I was learning, that was filtering, identification, estimation problems, and so on. And vision at that time seemed to offer a lot in terms of very interesting and tough problems.
It still does today, I would say.
It does today. But it was really at that time, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that vision people were moving from, let's say, geometry, looking at problems from a geometrical point of view, to filtering, stochastics, using probabilities, so all sort of things like particle filtering, estimation for nonlinear systems, manifolds, in an SO3, SE3,
and
that
definitely
stuff.
Going to talk about that later. I'm pretty sure. I mean, it's something that I want to dig into. But who would be the third then?
That would be the third. I don't know. That would be difficult. I would say that the third is sort of a group of people rather than one. I really enjoyed this series of workshops that this system identification field in Europe had for many years now. It's called ERSI, that stands for European Research Network on System Identification. It was formerly a network funded by the European Community. And then we were so happy that we even continued meeting regularly every year, even though we were no longer funded formally. So everybody was funded on his own research funds. And that has been a very nice environment. So every year we would have this workshop in a sort of isolated place. And we still do, COVID times excluded, so that you gather together, you stay there for 3 days, and you're, let's say, between quotes, forced to spend time with your peers and talk and chat and so on. So there I got to learn all the prominent, let's say, figures that were around the system identification community. I'm sure I will forget people, but starting from Lennart Leung, with whom then I work with, Thorsten Soderstrom in Sweden, then down Paul van den Hoff, Michel Verhagen, Jan Willems, Manfred Deistler, Bardemoor, and many others. Anders Lindqvist. I mean, it's been such a pleasure to hear conversation that was going from all the way from scientific point of view to, social stuff. And I think I've both learned and enjoyed a lot from that time.
We're definitely going to put a link to the ERNZ network if it's still alive. And I know that also
It's still alive, yes.
It's still alive. And also I know that the conference of reference for this whole network would be what is spelled CISID or S...
CISID.
Yeah, CISID, which stands for System Identification.
It's not for the network, actually, because CISID is the flagship symposium of IFEC for this one of the technical committees, TC11, that's on identification, essentially. So it's a symposium that is every 3 years. I mean, all IFEC symposium are every 3 years, but that's worldwide.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say that ERNZ is more for Europe, let's say.
ERNZ is more focused,
So we've been talking for a while about system identification, but we didn't define what it is. So maybe I should ask you, what is system identification?
System identification is dynamical model building from experimental data. So you measure data from your inputs, outputs, data from a system that's dynamical, that evolves over time, and you want to build a mathematical model. Let it be linear, nonlinear, whatever you think about it. But the science that is behind that, science and art, let's say, that is behind that is called system identification in our community, of course. And there are neighboring communities like statistics, econometrics, and many others where very similar problems are sort of tackled, and with perhaps slightly different languages. I mean, the type of ideas and problems are really the same.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're given a time series and we want to somehow estimate from this noisy, potentially time series, dynamic model, a system, what we would call. In doing my homework, I learned that the term was coined actually in 1953 by Lofty-Zadeh, if I'm not mistaken. And I know that effectively there are two lines of thought, at least traditionally in system identification. One that would follow, let's say, a more statistical route. So you minimize what is called the prediction error. And those are also called in literature of system identification prediction error methods. And then there are subspace methods. So maybe we can dig into these two topics. And I know that also you have done quite a bit of work on both.
So I wouldn't say that there are two streams of work or philosophies, let's say, but I would rather say that perhaps they start from a slightly different backgrounds in some sense. So as you said, in prediction error or maximum likelihood, you have your mathematical model in terms of a parameterized probabilistic description of your data, and you're just trying to solve by maximum likelihood by the principle of maximum likelihood for your parameter based on your data. Of course, you run into all sorts of issues when you have to solve nonlinear, non-convex optimization problems. You have local minima and all sorts of stuff. So subspace identification started basically trying to exploit ideas from realization theory. So how you go from, in realization theory, deterministic one from, say, impulse responses or dynamical system to state-space models. And in a stochastic framework, how you go from a second-order description, covariances of a time series, to a state-space model that describes this covariance sequence. And then linking trajectories of data to basically sample covariances, you can make the bridge and build tools to start from data sequences and go all the way to models and a state space form, as we like, without using iterative procedure. So projections that can be numerically efficiently implemented with linear algebra and solving essentially least squares problem and matrix factorization problems. So it was a way to go, let's say, one shot.
So on the one hand, we would have, let's say, a more optimization-oriented approach, which results effectively then into recursions, which try to minimize a certain function. Whereas on the other side, we acknowledge that the behavior of a linear time invariant system can be captured by data matrices, and then we exploit this fact in order to use tools from linear algebra to estimate the model.
Yeah.
Would that be fair to say?
Well, it would be fair to say.
And so where did you actually start your journey into system identification?
I actually started at a time where subspace ID was at its perhaps maximum. So there was a big hype, I would say, in our small community about subspace ID. And for instance, in these ERNSI workshops, I would say that half of it was about subspace identification, which had quite a long history at that time. I mean, I graduated in 96, so I started my PhD in 96, 97. Most of the algorithms that nowadays you can read about were already there at that time. So most of the work had been done, but it was sort of a forest. A lot of stuff there, and it was not completely clear what was the mutual relation, which algorithm would be better than another, under which conditions. And most importantly, all the statistical analysis of this method, consistency on one side, but also, let's say, asymptotic properties in terms of variances of the estimators and so on. I mean, some results were coming out, but the hard stuff was yet to come. So, and this is where basically we started working.
Yeah, at least from my perspective, some really interesting results were concerning the analysis of, as you say, of consistency of the estimates, but also of closed loop behavior of these algorithms. So if I try to estimate a system that is in closed loop, so I close a feedback loop around it, what can I hope to estimate? And what were your conclusions in that area?
No, that is a very actually important question that I forgot to mention. Yes, that was one very important part. People started asking this question. All these methods had been developed under this sort of weird assumption that you collect data in so-called open loop. That might be something strange from a non-controlled person. So we started studying that problem, what happens in closed loop. Well, actually, it was clear that a class of algorithms were not consistent under those conditions. So either you should do basically tricks, or you should modify these algorithms to make sure that you can actually handle the closed loop situation. And indeed, this is something you can do. And so you can modify algorithms or use algorithms in a way that you're still consistent under closed loop operations. And this is actually something very useful and important from the control point of view.
A quick note to the audience. What is consistency?
Consistency means as the number of data that you have goes to infinity, your estimator actually converge to, let's say, your true system. And of course, under the assumption that there is some underlying true system that is in the class of models that you consider to which you converge as the number of data goes to infinity.
Okay, and I guess from here, one question I would have is what is the state of the art of system identification today? So we mentioned that there are these two routes, but what are the available methods? Certainly, we had a very big influence of the success of machine learning recently in that respect, and kind of also led to a resurgence of interest into data-driven methods. We're definitely going to talk about all of these topics, but what's your view? What's the state of the art?
Well, the state of the art is evolving, but I would say that in the last 12 or 13, 14 years, a lot of research in our community is being influenced by machine learning ideas. Regularization based or Bayesian thinking, where you're trying to describe models or constraints in your models in a, let's say, flexible manner. I think that in our community, what sparkled the research in this area was a paper by my colleague Gianluigi Pilonetto and Giuseppe De Nicolao, Gianluigi in Padova and Giuseppe De Nicolao in Pavia. I actually came across by chance to this work. I found that exciting. And so I read it through, and I think at that time I started talking about this work with Lennart Ljunga, and that I felt it was one of the most prominent figures. I was curious to hear his opinion about this. I still remember that he said, well, I found this intriguing for model reduction purposes. But then it all started there, and then I started collaborating with Gianluigi, and it grew a lot from that point of view. And I would say that a lot of research in the last 15 years have been going around this framework and extended in different directions. That is also, starting from identification of linear single input, single output system, all the way to multivariable system, networks of system, sparsity arguments to estimate interconnected models, and so on and so forth. So it has had a lot of different developments.
Yeah, and you're serving me a good assist to mention that you have actually a new book coming out concerning this. It's called Regularized System Identification, Learning Dynamic Models from Data. There will be a link in the notes and the description, of course. What is this all about?
Yeah, thank you for for the assist. Yes, this is something that started 4 or 5 years back, 2016, I believe. So after many years of collaboration with Gianluigi, with Tianxi Chen, Giuseppe De Nicolao, and Lennart Ljunga, we decided it was time to put together our efforts and make some, let's say, give a consistent, ordered picture of what we believe at that time the field had sort of achieved. So the purpose of the book is to introduce all these regularization and Bayesian techniques, putting all together in a common framework and discuss and show how they can be useful to identify linear dynamical systems, non-linear dynamical systems as well, and then move to more, let's say, mathematically oriented questions. And then there are advanced chapters discussing the theory that is behind those things. So the reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, Gaussian processes, and so on.
Yeah, as the title of the book reflects, the core concept of the book is regularization.
Yeah.
I was digging into the literature a little bit, also doing my homework for this episode, and I managed to trace it back to Andrei Tikhonov. There's a beautiful discussion on stats stack exchange on this. I'll put a link in the show notes later. Initially, it was thought that he started this whole regularization business in the 60s, but then there's a paper actually from 1943 where he already shows that he was aware of the concept and of its potential uses. So maybe we can try to describe what is regularization in general, even in a very simple case like least squares.
Yeah. Okay. Regularization is a way to introduce stability in the inverse problem of estimating parameters from data. So let's say that you have a least squares problem, y equal to x times theta, where y and x are your data matrices and theta is your parameter vector. Let's say you want to find the argmean over theta of y minus theta, x theta, absolute value or norm squared, and you find the least squares solution. And then you ask the question, what happens if I do a small perturbation of my data? How sensitive is my estimator? So my theta hat, the solution of the least squares problem, under perturbation of my data. This is, of course, an inverse problem, finding the parameter theta from your data. And in the literature of inverse problems, you talk about ill conditioning, and when small perturbation on your measurements induce large perturbation on your parameter estimates. And this is something you don't want. In the literature of machine learning, this is called stability of algorithms. So you say that an algorithm is stable. There are different notions, but an algorithm is stable if under small perturbation of data, the model that you find doesn't change too much. And the way to make sure that an algorithm is stable is to basically constrain your parameter vector to stay in a certain region at a certain property and so on. And regularization is one way. So in a least squares problem, that would be instead of minimizing y minus x theta norm square, you minimize y minus x theta norm square plus the square norm of theta, perhaps. That's the simplest, of course, version, and there are tons of variations of that. And this has connections with what is machine learning is called generalization. And indeed, actually, you can prove that controlling stability of an algorithm, you can control its generalization properties.
So the idea is actually to accept some bias in the estimates in order to achieve better, let's say, variance error.
That is, yeah. And indeed, this is what is called in our community the so-called bias-variance trade-off. You give up for some bias to reduce variance.
And then I guess in moving on from a static picture like that of least squares to identification, where what I'm trying to estimate is now a dynamic model, you have to take into account the fact that this is a dynamic model and then there's causality involved as well. So what does the regularization picture offer, let's say, in this context?
Well, it offers a lot in the sense that this was the whole idea of Gianluigi and Giuseppe at the very beginning, because regularization, as you said, has been around for perhaps a century at the moment, because I could trace back ideas for sure in the 1920s. In the actuarial sciences, you find ideas of that sort. So perhaps even earlier, I'm not sure. But the sort of specific idea that they had is to build a regularizer, so way to stabilize the inverse problem, that account for the properties of dynamical systems. That is, as you said, causality, but also you have stability. So you want to find something that is stable, input-output from the dynamical system point of view, and so on. And that was an important step for the community. Then, of course, you may wonder whether these sort of ideas were new. And indeed, if you dig deep in the literature, you find out that back in the 50s already, people like Akaike, for instance, and other people were doing similar things, perhaps arriving at the same type or similar type of regularizers from a different perspective. But it was interesting, at least for me, to discover how much different communities, statistics, econometrics, numerical analysis had done.
Yeah, actually, this is something that I just learned. I didn't know that Akaike was involved in something similar. We should probably mention who Akaike was. He was a Japanese researcher, also very influential in the context of statistics, stochastic realization. There's even a criterion for model selection in his name. We'll put a note also about this in the description. Shifting gears, maybe, I would like to try and understand what is the connection between system identification and vision. So how did you end up working on, from my perspective, very interesting and cool problems in vision, also with very influential figures in the field, not only Stefano Soato, as you mentioned, but also Roger Brockett, incredibly prominent person in the field of control, nonlinear control, and many others.
Well, as I said earlier, at that time, vision people, at least part of the community working in vision, were shifting to exploiting and using probabilistic tools to solve problems arising in dynamic computer vision. And those things were, nonlinear filtering problem, basically. Very often, the complexity would arise from the fact that you're unknown where living in manifolds. So spaces where you have a lot of structure to account for, and where designing algorithms that are tailored to work in that scenario would give an advantage. So this is how I got there, basically. And then, we sort of looked at many different problems, all of them very difficult. And for some of them, we managed to do something interesting. For some others, we just gave up because it was too hard. But a few that I can mention that were sort of that I still remember is all the sort of work in what was called structure from motion. That is basically estimating both the structure of an environment as well as the motion that an observer has from monocular vision. And that was very hot at the time. So we were using, as other people were using at the time, so we were not the only one, of course, but basically approximate nonlinear filtering techniques like extended Kalman filters and so on, keeping into account, of course, as I said earlier, the structure of the underlying unknowns. You're estimating rotation matrices, translation, so you're unknown live in a special Euclidean group. So that was an interesting part of my work there. Then another work that was bridging my sort of previous expertise with the vision world was what we call dynamic textures. That is basically the idea of describing. Let me go back. In vision, we call a texture basically seeing a picture that has some spatially homogeneous properties, like breaks on a wall, or you look at the sea, you take a picture of the sea, so waves, and you look, they're stationary over space. But then if you think of something that is instead stationary over time, so you look at fire, flames and fire, you look at a sea surface over time, so you take a movie. So something that has similar stationary properties. And the idea was, can we connect with simple tools in linear time invariant stationary processes and describe this behavior with simple linear models? And indeed, basically, the idea was very simple. It was to factor the spatial behavior on one side and the temporal behavior on the other side. So the spatial behavior is something that you capture pretty easily. The temporal behavior you can describe pretty easily with the dynamical system, with linear time invariant dynamical system.
Which is amazing and quite surprising.
Which is
also
quite amazing. So you describe something that is, at least visually, something that looks like a very complicated phenomenon with a very simple model. And that one of the purposes at that time was to exploit these models for classification recognition purposes. So that was the main driving force at the beginning.
And are you also still active in the field of vision, or also how do you see the deluge of machine learning techniques now that invaded the field of vision?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not active any longer, not much at least in the vision world. And indeed, the advent of deep learning, I would say, as far as I understand from an outsider from the field now, has essentially killed all the literature, previous work in computer vision, that basically every problem that was considered to be, let's say, unsolved or solved only under very special conditions with previous techniques, with the advent of deep learning, would be just, we do it.
Which kind of compares to what you were mentioning before. So before there was an era where there was geometry, then came, let's say, the filtering, as you say, era, and now there's a new era where deep learning somehow
has invaded.
The arena of vision. Maybe we can move on to the next research topic. I know that you're quite active, at least you seem to be quite active in the field of data-driven methods, where I suppose you can exploit a large baggage of tools that you built over the years in the field of system identification in order to essentially think about design methods that only rely on data.
Yeah, well, the first answer would be, is there any difference between data-driven and system identification? I mean, after all, in system identification, we're after exploiting data to make decision or exploit, building models from data to make decision or predictions and so on. So this whole field of data-driven methods for whatever purpose you may want is really starting from data to do something, and you may or may not see a dynamical model in the middle as an intermediate step to be used as a base of your decision predictions and so on. And sometimes this is explicit, sometimes you can hide it inside your equations, models, computations, whatever. But it's really, I believe there is huge connection. Also, perhaps it's useful to exploit quite a bit of work and experience that people in this area have done, all the research that has been done over the years, to see whether looking at the same problem from a different point of view, as perhaps this whole field of data-driven control or has taken, may give us sort of new ideas, new viewpoints that allows us to advance in a new direction.
Yeah, I'm actually curious to hear your point of view as an expert in the field of where is the field of system identification going, especially given also all the influence of the success of machine learning and the computing power that keeps on growing effectively. So,
oh, sure. I mean, as I said earlier, system identification is a small community, and similar problems have been looked at in very different communities. And I mentioned statistics and I mentioned econometrics. That is where the role of dynamical models was important. So, to my understanding, the field of system identification is, between quotes, different from a lot of things that are being done in machine learning, is the idea of having or exploiting or being after dynamical behavior. So for sure, we as a community should exploit and as much as possible all the tools that people in machine learning have been developing, the ability of exploiting high, very powerful computing platforms, while at the same time possibly exploiting our expertise on the role that dynamics plays, on the structure of the model play, to perhaps being able to structure models while also making use of very rich, very powerful structure like, say, deep neural networks, to name one that is very famous at the moment.
Yeah, this is something that would have been my follow-up question. What can we give back, in a sense? So we are talking about the influence of other fields within our own, but what can we offer to other neighboring fields?
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's very tough. Probably I don't have an answer, not definite answer. For sure, I believe that the understanding of the importance of key properties, and you mentioned one earlier, like causality and stability, when it came to exploiting, let's say, regularization kernels and so on in the context of linear system identification, but you can go to nonlinear and exploit similar ideas. These are very useful, or have been very useful, to tailor these regularization structures so as you exploit them better for your purposes. Perhaps we can do the same with different model structure. I mean, deep neural network is one, but understanding which are the key properties we're after and how we can exploit these properties to, let's say, regularize, to constrain, to improve in terms of generalization capabilities and so on. That's an important aspect from my point of view. And of course, whether this is of a wide interest or remains sort of more confined inside our community, I'm not sure.
I mean, and this is an interesting point of view, especially given that it comes from a big expert in the field. Maybe in transitioning towards a lighter part of the chat we're having, we can start pulling out a few questions that are coming also from the audience. Please check out our website as well if you want to ask questions to our future speakers. One of them is, what about things that you would have liked to know when you began your career? Is there anything that you would have wanted to know?
Oh, man. I don't know. Discovering things is nice. And it's also nice to change your path based on what happens. No, I wouldn't say that I would have changed things based on different information. So
you would do it all essentially all in the same way it happened.
Well, things might have happened in a different way depending on the particular path, but I wouldn't know how to answer at the moment.
Another interesting question, at least for me, that I tend to ask to everyone that appears on the show is, what would you do if you were a student today? So what choices would you make in order to live possibly a successful and happy life? Or if you were to imagine that you wanted to jump into research, what would it be the best advice that you can give?
Well, I don't go as far as happiness. That I believe is really personal and it's related to what you like to do and what you're looking for. But as a student, I believe that if you're willing to stay within the, say, academia or research community, curiosity is the first thing. Patience is the other. You need a lot. And perseverance, I would say. I mean, research requires to keep on doing that for quite some time, and it'll be discouraged at some point. Don't worry. That happens to everybody, I believe.
Even at later stages.
Even at later stages, of course. But, at later stages, perhaps you have a bit more experience and you sort of, you know how it works, then it takes time, and very often you fail. And then you have to fail a few times in a row, and then perhaps you manage to get out something if you dig deep.
I think those three words are fantastic, actually. So curiosity, patience, and perseverance. That's wonderful advice, in my opinion. I just want to mention in closing that not many out there may know that you're, in fact, a semi or even professional skier. Can we mention that on the podcast?
You can mention, of course. I would rather say semi-professional. I would say that I've never been a professional.
I'm curious to understand what makes a professional. I mean, you've been definitely competing in skiing, and are you still active?
I'm still sort of active as a hobby, and it's always been a hobby for me. I started relatively late, I would say. I was, in mid school, perhaps, I don't know, with racing. But, I was skiing very occasionally, I would say, as compared to my fellow friends and kids. I think I started sort of doing that with more passion, not passion, but with more, spending more time, let's say, on it, when I started my bachelor, basically. And I managed to find a good equilibrium between studying and training. And of course, that's something that I liked. I like being outside. I like being in the mountains. So that was my first goal. And then I enjoyed. I like the idea of training. I like the idea of pushing hard towards some direction.
And you did win some medals, right?
Yeah. I think I enjoyed a lot. As you said before, there are up and downs. And sometimes you spend a lot of effort and you don't see results coming out and you're getting tired and you say, I'm going to quit soon. And then all of a sudden you start winning again and then you say, okay. And you enjoy.
To me, it's just amazing that one can manage to be such a successful, researcher as well as almost a professional sportsman at that level. This is just incredible. In general, thanks for being with us. We are reaching the end of our chat. Thanks for taking the time for joining us on our show.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.